Welcome to today's Explainer. Think of me as your literature professor for the next few minutes. Now, I want you to picture this. It's 1945. The Second World War has just ended, and the world, well, it's physically, economically, and spiritually in pieces. As the dust settles, writers look around and realize the old ways of making sense of things, those high modernist experiments of the early 20th century, they just don't fit anymore. While novelists might have responded with radical, fractured storytelling, poets had to find a completely new, deeply personal voice to navigate this changed society. So today, we're going to explore the absolutely fascinating shifts in post-war poetry across the English-speaking world. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into our syllabus. We're looking at Part 1, A World in Pieces. Part 2, The Movement Takes Control. Part 3, Breaking Form with Experimentation. Part 4, The American Identity Revolt. And finally, Part 5, Reclaiming the Personal Voice.
Mapping out this chronological evolution, from the spiritual crisis of 1945 straight through to the narrative focus of the 1970s, you'll notice something pretty profound. What makes this era of poetry so captivating is that, unlike fiction, which adopted sweeping, fragmented post-modern structures right out of the gate, poetry took a much more subjective, intimate path. It really evolved to explore deeply personal experiences against the backdrop of massive social transformation. Part 1. A World in Pieces. We're looking at the immediate aftermath of World War II and how it fractured the transatlantic literary landscape. And this brilliantly illustrates the geographic divide of the late 1940s. In the UK, the war was felt as an outrageous interruption to their tradition. The physical and emotional bombing of Britain literally necessitated entirely new literary canons. But over in the US, completely different story. America initially struggled to produce a cohesive group of war poets. Instead, they kind of kept clinging to the pre-war modernist traditions of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Part 2, The Movement Takes Control. Fast forward to the 1950s in Britain, where writers sought a grounding retreat to order amid the chaos. This brings us to a dominant force known simply as the movement. Emerging in the mid-50s through anthologies like New Lines, poets like Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis totally rejected the obscure, arch-magical Celtic imagery of the era's neo-romantics. They adopted what was called an empirical attitude. Actually, the critic Stephen Spender famously labeled this the rebellion of the lower middle brows. These were often grammar school-educated writers who wanted to write about drab, everyday reality. They wanted poetry to be observable, witty, precise, and spoken in a language regular people actually used. Historically, this British empirical attitude sat in stark contrast to the explosive inward-turning confessional movements that would soon bubble up in America. No one embodied this better than Philip Larkin, who's often called the voice of the movement. When Larkin writes "Existence is Without Man," he captures this profound sense of resignation, a feeling of modern isolation that, honestly, a lot of us can still deeply relate to today. In his landmark collection, The Wits and Weddings, Larkin perfectly marries this bleak modern outlook with incredibly traditional forms, like iambic pentameter. By doing so, he highlights the drab ugliness of daily life, turning mundane things like ambulances and advertisement boards into powerful, haunting symbols. Part 3. Breaking Form with Experimentation. Let's move to the 1960s, transitioning from restoring order to a radical, explosive literary rebellion. I want you to think of traditional 1950s poetry, like Larkin's work, as a perfectly structured, traditional stone cottage. It's solid, it follows the rules of gravity, and it keeps the rain out. But the experimental forms of the 1960s, that was like taking the very fabric of language, tearing the threads apart, and analyzing how the raw material itself functions. They stopped caring about the cottage and started caring about the concept of shelter itself. This linguistic deconstruction took several really fascinating forms. You had minimalism, practiced by poets like Ian Hamilton Finley, which operated on the idea that less means more, uncovering absolute wonders in the smallest elements of language, right down to the phoneme. Then there was concrete poetry. British pioneers like Edwin Morgan actually treated words as physical visual objects on the page, inventing new forms like the matrix poem that mimics computer language. Later on, this evolved into language poetry, which deliberately fragmented syntax and resisted conventional meaning, literally forcing the reader to actively participate in building the poem's significance. Part 4, The American Identity Revolt. Time to pivot back across the Atlantic, where a completely different kind of explosion was happening. The post-war deference to European modernists like Eliot and Pound began to feel pretty authoritarian to young American writers. Fueled by the memograph revolution, which allowed for the cheap, rapid distribution of new ideas, diverse voices just exploded onto the scene. You had the beat poets like Allen Ginsberg, challenging academic and mainstream consumerist values with a huge focus on spiritual exploration. In tandem with the civil rights era, Black poetry emerged as a powerful force. Writers like Leroy Jones utilized verse explicitly as a revolutionary tool for liberation. And finally, the confessional poets turned the lens entirely inward. These movements laid the absolute crucial groundwork for the modern spoken word and slam poetry we see today.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the poet Robert Lowell described Sylvia Plath's groundbreaking collection Ariel. He called it the autobiography of a fever and noted her use of controlled hallucination. The confessional poets bridged the conscious and the unconscious. They took their most romantic, deeply painful inner lives and turned them into poetry with unflinching, almost terrifying intensity. It was intensely personal, yet deeply resonant with a whole generation grappling with its own psychological frontiers.
Part 5. Reclaiming the personal voice. This inward turn sets the perfect stage for our final act, the 1970s and 1980s. Treating this as a sort of textbook artifact for a moment, a prime example of this era is the rise of the Ulster poets in Northern Ireland. As the region was engulfed in the grave political and sectarian violence known as the Troubles, poets from this peripheral culture gained immense prominence. They found themselves having to navigate an incredibly complex political landscape, using their verse to reflect on history, violence, and their own national identity. So the crucial point is captured beautifully here by Seamus Heaney, who viewed his craft as almost a mode of power, certainly a mode of resistance against colonization. What made Heaney so respected across political divides was his ability to brilliantly connect ancient, primitive Irish myths to contemporary conflicts. He faced the ambivalence and brutal realities of his homeland situation with total, unflinching honesty. In a very similar vein of reclaiming power, the 1970s saw the feminist movement catalyze an unprecedented growth in women's poetry. Poets like Adrienne Rich used their verses to systematically question patriarchal assumptions. They expanded the thematic range of poetry, addressing previously taboo topics like domestic violence, sexuality, and motherhood with unprecedented frankness. It really proves that poetry isn't just dusty history. It's a living mechanism you can use to give a massive megaphone to the marginalized. So as we wrap up today's syllabus, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. From the rubble of 1945 to the quiet desperation of the movement, to the radical experiments of the 60s and the fierce identity claiming of the 70s and 80s, poetry has constantly reinvented itself. Despite endless predictions of its decline in our fast-paced, visually oriented culture, the form continues to thrive. Why? Because there's literally nothing else quite like it. Its unique ability to compress the vastness of complex human emotion into language of unusual precision and power is exactly what we need in an age of information overload. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring the magic of verse, and I'll catch you next time.